I'm recording in progress. I am recording this for the purposes of sharing it one-on-one with anyone who misses this briefing and asks, hey, can I get some information about it? So I will stress to anyone who does that we're not to post this. This is kind of a private conversation that we're having, but I thought we might as well record this because inevitably someone will ask. So once again, somebody nod just to let me know that you can see PowerPoint slides going on. Okay, so this project is in a way one of the first ones that Carleton has taken on to try and project outside of our walls in terms of what's going on in the world of journalism and in fostering equity, diversity, and inclusion. As most of you will be aware, we're trying to do everything that we can to foster equity, diversity, and inclusion in what we do at Carleton, in our classes, and who teaches your classes, et cetera, et cetera. This project is really important because it's an attempt to look at what is actually going on in the world of journalism, in journalism practice, outside of hiring, which there's a lot of legitimate discussion around who gets hired, who works in our newsrooms, but also how journalism is done. And one of the core activities in journalism at every level is interviewing people, finding people to interview, finding sources, talking to them, interacting with them, and then putting that material into stories. So Joanna Smith, who's the Ottawa Bureau Chief for Canadian Press, had already done considerable work in starting to research how Canadian Press does this, how reporters and editors at Canadian Press make decisions about who gets interviewed. And there is some of this work going on in the industry as well with various players. It's being done in different ways. And so we thought Carleton and Canadian Press should collaborate, try to get a bit of money so that we could pay journalism students to help with this research. And so this is how this project came about. It's through a SSHRC Partnership Engage grant, but none of that matters to you, except that means that somebody thinks we're doing something that's worth putting some funding into. So the team that you would be seeking to join, and when I look at this picture, it makes me think this had to have been taken before COVID because we all look so bright and shiny in these photos. Myself, Joanna Smith from Canadian Press, as I mentioned, Nanava Duncan, who is the Carty Chair in Journalism, Diversity, and Inclusion Studies here at Carleton, Kate Hopwood, who is a business editor at Canadian Press, Brett Popplewell, who is another professor and faculty member at Carleton, also heads our permanent working group on anti-racism, and Randy Boswell, longtime Ottawa Citizen reporter, faculty member at Carleton. So this is the existing team that got together and created the idea, the concept for the project and submitted that to SSHRC. We got the funding. Now we need to do the next thing, which is hire. 4 research assistants is the number that we settled on as people who we would like to have working with us. With all hiring processes, this is always a bit fuzzy, but there are certainly some very clear guidelines of the kind of people we are hoping to recruit to work on this project. You have to be a senior student in our program. We think the skill set that is needed to go and do the internship, which is part of this, I'll come to that, but also to do the research. I think you have to be already fairly advanced in what we're teaching here at Carleton. So we're looking at BJ3, BJ4, and MJ students as candidates to be research assistants. While it's not mandatory that you be bilingual in French and English or Francophone, it would certainly be an asset for some of these researchers, at least, to have that capacity. Because La Presse Canadienne, the Francophone partner institution version of Canadian Press, is going to be involved with this project as we move along. Again, it would be an asset to have had some experience working on a research project, especially if you use NVivo and Qualtrics and those platforms. That's something that would be of value. We're not going to exclude people who don't have that experience, but that would be useful. This is the thing that every potential employer says: we want bright, energetic, hardworking. I mean, demonstrate to us that you want to do this work, that you're you're skilled at doing this kind of work and that you will get it done. We'll also be asking you for references because sometimes your profs might also have a view on that. Are you somebody that fits that description? And we absolutely want to put together a diverse team among these 4 research assistants that reflects the student body, reflects Canada. So there's a timeline. All things can change, as we have learned this year, but we have to sort of set some benchmarks to try and keep things going. So even though this seems very tight, I would like to have an application deadline as early as possible. This means I need to get an application kit up and available to you. There could be an application deadline as early as February 4th, which is in about, what is that, 10 days time, less than that. It's not an onerous application. It's mainly telling us who you are, why you'd be good on this project, giving us your CV, and telling us who has taught you at Carleton that we could ask about you and your work. We'll try to make these decisions fairly quickly. There are likely to be some interviews. We probably won't interview everyone who applies, but I think we'll come up with a short list and then interview candidates and try to hire as soon as we can so that you can start to plan for this. One thing to have in mind, there is a very important activity on this project that will take place during reading week. So you have to be available for that. And it's also possible that you could embark on an internship at Canadian Press during reading week as part of this project. So that's something to keep in mind. A key activity, and I'll come to it in a second, we're doing a roundtable of a small number of experts and media industry stakeholders on this subject on February 23rd to kind of brainstorm what they've been doing, what we want to do, and have that inform our research going forward. Late February, as I said, you'll be into internships at CP and then into the work of the project. This is kind of another way of looking at the timeline. Essentially, yeah, starting now, I'm working already on the ethics approval for this project. We'll have the roundtable in February. February, March, the 4 research assistants will do an internship at CP. March, April, those research assistants will start this work of interviewing and surveying reporters and editors who work for Canadian Press, and also representatives of some media organizations. The goal of all this is to develop the type of questionnaire that CP reporters could use when they start an interview with someone, and to extract from that interview subject self-identifying information about them so that we can build this database to show us the diversity in sourcing. That part of the project then, CP using that questionnaire over the course of the early summer will literally be in the field. Canadian Press will be using this questionnaire that we design. We'll get a chance to see what type of data emerges from that, and more or less finish the first stage of this project, which is creating and piloting this type of questionnaire with CP. We're kind of assuming, hoping that there'll be another stage to this project, right? That we'll then go further with it in a second iteration. So what are we trying to do? We are trying to figure out how reporters and editors identify sources, and how does this happen? Because Canadian Press has initiated this. This was Joanna's idea, came to Carleton and said, would you like to partner with us on this? We're getting kind of rare privileged access to Canada's national press agency, and getting the ability to look at what they do, have a chance to examine documentation and policy practices, and talk to reporters and editors about how they make these decisions. We're also going to build on those best practices and talk to other organizations to develop this type of questionnaire, because it's not a given. It's not simple what you would ask people or how you would go about asking people at the beginning of an interview to share this information about themselves. So that's a key thing that we have to figure out. And then eventually we'll be identifying what are the barriers to greater diversity in sourcing. If we see from the data that there's still not diversity in sourcing that reflects the Canadian population. And eventually, we'll try to find a way to look at, does better sourcing make for better journalism, right? How do we actually gauge that fostering more diversity in your sourcing makes for better journalism? Apart from the obvious point that we should be doing this. This is how modern journalism should function. A few guiding principles, and I tried to make each slide look different so that the points would seem like they're somehow building on each other. Others have been doing this kind of work. There have been efforts, but mostly kind of machine learning efforts that look at the journalism and try to figure out who the sources were, right? By guessing from their names, their gender, but rarely have sources been asked to self-identify. And so that's a key thing about this. We need to find a mechanism, simple, quick, efficient, for sources to quickly say, this is who I am, and share that information with us. We have to, of course, be very specific about those categories. It's not sufficient to ask someone if they're a Black Canadian, if they're a person of color. We have to look at all of the various ways that this kind of data can be gathered, and Statistics Canada is one source, and figure out what we want our questionnaire to look like, and what are the categories that people will be able to choose. Another thing, we want to look at the sources that journalists choose to talk to. So if journalists go to a press conference by the Prime Minister or by Theresa Tam, the Medical Officer of Health, they have not made a decision, I'm going to quote that person, right? That decision has been made for them by a press conference. So we want to limit this to instances where journalists are making choices about who they set out to interview. And so some of the research questions is, how does this happen? You know, what are the methods and practices that journalists use? Or is it totally on the back of an envelope? Do they even think about this? You know, what are the norms? What is the demographic composition of sourcing by Canadian press? Because we will get access to that information when we run this pilot of the questionnaire. We want this questionnaire to be informed by organizations that advocate for underrepresented communities. Canadian Association of Black Journalists, for example. We want that input about the way we frame this questionnaire and how we go about asking these questions. And what sort of framework for self-identification of sources is going to bring about greater diversity. This roundtable that we're holding on the 23rd, this was partly to recognize a lot of work's been done on this already. We're not inventing this concept. Informed Opinions, BBC, Bloomberg, NPR, Canadian Press have all in different ways done research, studies, newsroom interventions that are seeking to foster diversity in sourcing. So we want to learn from those exercises. So what we're thinking of on this, on the 23rd is part of a day, probably most of a day, where we start in the morning with those experts. Then we go into a session with some journalism community stakeholders, editors and reporters, as well as advocacy organizations to reflect on that, talk about it, share concepts about how this could be done. And then in a final session, literally look at what are we going to be doing in this research, and how has the work that others have already done, how will that influence the way we go about doing our research, the questions we ask, and the methodology that we use. So the project work, you're going to be looking at research that's already been done, helping to design, and then conduct a survey with CP reporters and editors about how they do this. How do they approach diversity in sourcing? Having these interactions with affected communities, developing the type of the key thing is this questionnaire. And I sort of visualize a little online, a link that sources are given at the beginning of an interview. Would you mind taking 20 seconds to just do this quick survey before we start our interview. They go to it, they click, 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 and then we start the interview. I think if you just gave somebody a questionnaire to fill afterwards, your participating, the rate of people doing that is going to be much lower. But that's one of the things to figure out. CP reporters will be using this questionnaire that we develop, and then we'll look at the information that we have gathered and figure out what have we learned, and does this work as a tool to foster diversity, and what do we do next? What you probably most want to know, what's this work? Well, we've sort of calculated, this could change slightly, but this is our starting point. We think there's about 150 hours of paid work. It's paid at $28 an hour plus 14% for benefits. So total salary for each of these 4 students of just under $5,000. Part of that salary will cover a 2-week paid internship at CP. We're not sure yet if that's going to be in person or virtually in the Ottawa Bureau and the Toronto Bureau. If it is in person and there's travel involved, then as many of those basic costs as we can cover will be covered. If some people have to go to Toronto or potentially Montreal, I guess, in this exercise. We will have to give some training in using Qualtrics for designing and delivering surveys, and in vivo for storing and analyzing the data that we gather. I've never used either of those things, so I'll be part of this training as well. And hopefully it'd be nice if this goes gangbusters, and at the end of it we apply for and get another grant to do a bigger version of this and go further with the work. So there is a possibility of a follow-up phase to this project. I realize for BJ3s and MJ1s, you've got another whole academic year in your lifespan at Carleton. So I think it would be good for us to have some students from that level on this team for continuity if the work goes forward. But also, obviously, we have some terrific candidates at the BJ4 and MJ2 level who ideally will be graduating at the end of this year. But in this case, there is work that would be involved with this project right through the summer. And as I understand the rules at Carleton, your medical coverage, your health insurance coverage as students can carry you through the summer months if you are being paid by Carleton on a project. So that's kind of what we know so far. And I'm sorry it's been all me talking, so I want to stop sharing the screen and basically just throw this open if Joanna or any others from the current research team want to jump in and amplify or correct.
Sure. No, I won't correct. I just wanted to jump in and introduce myself. So my name, as you know, I'm Joanna Smith. I'm the Ottawa Bureau Chief at the Canadian Press. And I also spent about 4 or 5 years teaching the 3rd year undergraduate reporting in depth class at Carleton, which I loved. I think Ralph, yeah, is one of my former students in the crowd here. Apologize if I'm missing anyone else. So I guess wanted to share a little bit more about why I came up with this whole idea and what sort of my ultimate goal for it is, and really want to stress a couple of things. So I always like to frame it as, no reporter worth his or her or their salt would go out to a 5-alarm apartment fire and come back to their editor with a story based entirely on an interview with the landlord who, gosh darn it, forgot to put the batteries in the smoke alarm again, right? That is a failure of journalism. To not interview the tenants who lost their belongings, to not interview the fire marshal investigating this, to not interview the witness who heard the landlord bragging about how he was trying to save money by not putting batteries in the fire alarm, right? And yet, over and over and over again, Canadian journalism turns to the same sources, and let's be honest, largely male, largely white, largely institutional, high status, higher income, from a certain experience, to write stories about everything. And it's very clear that it's not adequate. It is very clear that means that we are missing out on many stories. We are being exclusive. We are not being welcoming. And we are just being, frankly, not great journalists. And so we've known for a long time this is a problem. And there's been efforts for years about how we need to get better at this. And so I thought 3 years ago now, I thought, well, you don't understand the scope of a problem without any data. So I embarked upon just a really informal pilot project in our coverage in the Ottawa Bureau and thought, okay, we've been told for a while now, this is a priority. Everyone's making it a priority. Let's see how we do. Numbers were terrible. I use a very rough methodology that I don't want to replicate for this project for reasons that become obvious as soon as I explain it. Googling people's photos and taking a guess at what their background is, not ideal, right? And that's why self-identification is such a key part of this. And that's actually, by the way, why there have been many efforts to do this with sex and gender, and less so with other identities, such as race, such as disability, such as sexual identity or expression, because, you can automate a lot of the gender stuff by he said, she said, they said, and it's a lot harder to do it the other way without coming out and asking people. So I understand there's some discomfort with coming out and asking people, and that's what we're really hoping these students can help us figure out. That's something we've been batting around for a while. And the other thing I really want to stress is that last question that Alan highlighted in terms of the longer term goal of this project, and does improving our sourcing improve our journalism. I really want to stress this is not about checking boxes, making sure every story has, a certain kind of person in it quoting. The whole point of this is that if we are going to a greater variety of people to interview, then that will lead to a greater variety of stories. We will ask them at the end of the interview, okay, well, I called you up to interview about the bank rate, but what else is going on, right? That's always a classic smart question to ask an expert at the end of the interview is, what else can you tell me? And we're hoping that will lead to stories that are right now not being covered or not being covered adequately. And so I just really keen to see who ends up joining this project, keen to welcome you to the Ottawa Bureau, be it in person or virtually, and really excited to work with you and see where this goes. Thank you.
Great. Anybody else want to jump in, or anyone with a question? And there's a lot of faces on my screen, so I think the easiest way is just turn your mic on and jump in. Lahari, I see up at the top.
Hi, thank you, and thank you, Joanna. I have a bunch of questions, but I suppose they all merge into one. How are we going to go about making the process of determining self-identification, but even self-identification in general, safe for people? I don't want to jump ahead of myself, but there is a general distrust of the media as a whole, of journalists, and as student journalists. How are we going to make that process safe for our research subject?
I'll go first quickly, but Joanna will probably want to wade in. This, as I understand it, the data that we're collecting will be anonymized in terms of the overall picture of the diversity in sourcing. So when someone clicks on this survey, they're not telling the journalist who's interviewing them how they self-identify. They're telling an anonymous database how they self-identify. But part of that survey response, as I understand it, and all these things are in the works, would also give that person the opportunity to say, I would be happy to be interviewed about this question later on, at which point they would be connecting their self-identification information with them as a person to someone that they're speaking with. But my understanding is that this data has to be protected, which is part of the use of the database and the ethics clearances, that they have to know how they self-identify. is private and is going into an anonymized database where we get the bigger picture of who's being sourcing. But they will have the option to say, I would be happy to talk to someone about this further in an interview. Does that answer it properly?
The other thing I'll just add is this would be something that would come up in an interview when someone has already agreed to talk, right? So it's not, if you're thinking about the reporting and news gathering process, you're not sort of asking this question before someone agrees to an interview. We're hoping that the student researchers can help us come up with a methodology where it sort of seamlessly fits into the interview process. The good news is this has been done to a certain extent by others. It's largely done more in the TV world, like Bloomberg, for example, has really done it when it comes to booking guests. And so there's sort of a natural model there. It hasn't really been done in sort of print before to this extent outside of gender, but yeah, that's sort of exactly the how is what exactly we're hoping to get out of this project, because that's something we've been trying to crack for a couple of years now.
Okay, I see Dennis's hand up.
What is the exact scope of this study? So is this about, for example, ethnicity and race and sexual and gender identification, or does it extend also to self-identified socioeconomic class and political orientation, for example, and whether the people who are going to be interviewed or to whom the surveys are going to be sent, are they Canadian born or immigrant? What is the exact scope? What are the research metrics for this study?
It's a really good question. Some of that's to be determined. Right now, the focus is on membership in what we call an equity seeking group, according to the Employment Equity Act sort of thing. So that would be race and gender, disability, sexual orientation. We're going to sort of be starting with, at CP, we've already started with gender, and that was a sort of recommendation by all the others who have done this has suggested to us, just because of it's a way to sort of like get your toes into it, I guess. So we've partnered with the BBC. Canadian Press is one of the couple hundred news organizations as part of the BBC 50/50 project, it's called. So that pilot project has already been going on for a couple of months now within our business department. So we have some stuff there. In terms of political affiliation, everything, no, that's not in the works right now. But what I do envision it including as well, and I meant to say this in the intro, was categories of people. So, you think of like police officer or activist, politician or voter, right? Because that's some of the analysis I'm really interested in doing. Is there's been lots written about the over-reliance of by journalists on institutional sources and what kind of stories and voices we are missing by routinely going to institutional sources. So we're hoping that some of the analysis gets into that as well.
Okay. William, I see a hand.
Sorry, yeah, more of a procedural question. Is the stuff during reading week, is that going to be happening virtually, or will that be in person? Because if some of us, if like we are traveling or if we're away that week, like do we have to be in Ottawa physically?
So two answers to that in a way. It'll depend whether or not you end up doing the internship during reading week. Typically at Carleton, we encourage students to do a 2-week internship straddling reading week, right? So that you're not missing 2 weeks of classes. It doesn't always work out. So there are sometimes students who do their 2 weeks outside of reading week. So, but we absolutely want people to participate in the roundtable workshop on February 23rd. Since most of the participants in that will be joining virtually online, I don't think it would be a problem for a research assistant to participate in that February 23rd workshop online. But timing of the internships, because part of this gig is a 2-week internship at CP. So whether that internship is reading week and the week after, or the week after reading week and the week after that. We certainly want those internships to take place as soon as possible at the beginning of the project, because the notion of the internship is not just, oh, let's fold a paid gig into this job. This is essentially a chance to be embedded in CP and to spend time doing the work of a reporter or editor at CP. So understanding the way this job actually unfolds day by day, and just starting to have some conversations with people about sourcing. It won't be the time when you would be doing surveys or interviews, because those have to be informed by an ethics process where people have agreed ahead of time, yes, I will do this interview as part of this project.
Thank you.
Okay. Rachel.
Yeah, just a couple of things. The first one was just, I know a couple of BJ4s, we've already had to set up some winter internships, but in this case, would the CP internship have to replace those other ones that are potentially set up for those of us? And also the second question was just about how the hours are going to be broken up, those 150 hours, because you mentioned it was over the course of February to the summer.
Yeah, I'd actually need to check, I guess, with Aniran, who's currently managing the internships, whether or not it would still be possible to do both. I would like to think yes, but it'll depend a lot on the timing. So I think that's to be resolved on a case-by-case basis. In terms of the rest of the hours, we kind of guesstimated, to be honest. We had to put a figure on this for the purposes of a budget. It's not full-time employment for April, May, June, July, but it's a significant number of hours per week. And to be honest, I think after we have this initial roundtable and scope out how we're going to go about doing the project, we'll be able to then come up with a much clearer schedule where we anticipate you're going to need to put in this many hours at this time. There may be fits and starts, times when you're not really working on this for a few days, or if you have another thing that you absolutely have to do, there'll be some flexibility around that. So it's a little bit to be determined, but we also wanted people to know when they commit to this by applying, this is what you will be able to, at a minimum, this is what you would earn. We doubt it'd be much more than that, but this is what you could plan on if you take part in the project.
Thank you.
Okay, other questions? I'm not seeing any hands up, but if somebody thinks they have their hand up and I don't see it, just put your mic on and jump in. I saw Lillian's lips moving, but I think she's talking to somebody else.
Yeah, sorry, I was just thinking about the internship.
Yeah, okay. No, that's okay.
That like 2 weeks would work into if we need, because we have to get another 8 weeks on top of that. So I'm just kind of doing the math over the summer, how that would look.
That's a good point. For those MJ students have a requirement of how many weeks they have to work in a media capacity for graduation. I would certainly be willing to look at ways that we could calculate a good amount of this time toward the work requirement. So again, that's like a case-by-case thing, but I think I wouldn't exclude the possibility at all that some of the weeks that you would put into your work as a research assistant on this project would count toward the work requirement in the MJ. I wouldn't want people to make a decision, oh, I can't do that because I need to get this other, these other number of weeks.
Thank you. That actually clarifies that a lot.
Okay. Well, I'm glad I noticed your lips moving. Yes, Emma. Perot.
I just had a question more about like the application process. I was just wondering how many references you guys were looking for.
I think at most it'll be 2. And we'll likely ask for people who have taught you at Carleton, because I can reach them more quickly and can lean on them to tell me about you.
Okay, awesome. Thank you.
And I also generally tell people in references for this kind of thing, don't give me the lovely, you know, somewhat generic reference letter that often goes to employers. I have sometimes given people a kind of a little questionnaire to fill so that they can tell me very quickly, absolutely hire this person. They're fantastic. They'd be good at this. They'd be okay at this. Or I would have concerns about this person. I don't want a bunch of pro forma, you know, the kind of nice letters that you often get when you ask for references. I don't want those. I want a really frank assessment so that we get a good fix on who you are if we don't know you already. Lahar, is that a new hand up? And tell me I've said your name right. I haven't taught you, so I'm sorry. I haven't learned the proper pronunciation.
Oh, it's Larry. So if you imagine E's instead of the A's in my first name, it should be good.
Larry.
Yes, there you go. Thank you. I wanted to ask, in terms of the references, do they have to be from instructors or can they also be from employers if they've been at Carleton University?
I would say a combination of both. I would absolutely like an instructor because they often have the best fix on your journalism skills, on the kind of work you do, the work ethic, for lack of a better term. Is this somebody who gets their work done, who's professional, reliable? Those are the kinds of things we want to know about. But so one of them, I think, should be someone who was an instructor in a reporting skills class. I think it could also be useful to have, if you had a second reference that was somebody who employed you. So someone that you worked for a TA as, for example. Other questions? Anyone among the current team who wants to amplify anything or add? Randy, Nanaba?
Maybe just invite folks who may have other questions after to be in touch, you know, beyond this session.
Yeah, so anything and everything, as we always tell you in reporting classes, there's no such thing as a stupid question. There are just stupid answers. So don't hesitate to ask anything at all. And you can ask things in confidence if you're worried about something like, can I do this when I'm also doing that? Or absolutely feel free to ask. So just to centralize this, feel free to email me directly at Carleton with any questions that you have. I'm going to get back to people as soon as possible with an application kit and a deadline. I don't want it to be onerous. I know we're all like whacked. So essentially you should be able to fill in some bio data, tell us in a page or less, this is who I am, this is what I'm good at, this is why I think I would be really useful on this project. And also we'll learn something from your references. I may ask people to save us looking this up. I may ask for your GPA, and I'm not saying this depends on your grades, but you know, there is a difference between having an 8 and a 12 in the GPA world, and sometimes it's an indication if we get down to tough decisions about shortlists and hiring. So it's just one of the factors that we could ask about. Okay. Any other questions? Wow, I said this would be 45 minutes and it's actually right on time. So I guess I'll end it there, and I don't want to keep people on their screens any longer than necessary. So I'll share this slide deck with you, and I'll share this recording with anyone who asks for it. If you know of anyone else who wanted to be here and couldn't, please tell them to be in touch. And again, thank you for signing up to find out more about this. that's really encouraging to see this many people who are interested in this type of project. So great. All right. Well, thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.